What's one truth you wish you'd said out loud when you were younger?
At Thanksgiving, with the turkey halfway carved and the table crowded with the usual mix of polite chatter and thinly veiled competition, my sister Megan leaned back in her chair, tilted her head slightly, and with that smirk she has perfected since high school, announced to no one in particular, but clearly for my benefit, some of us just have a natural talent for leadership. Before I could even decide whether to respond, our Uncle Kevin, who has never exactly been known for subtlety, set his fork down, looked directly at her, then turned to me, and asked in a perfectly casual tone, "Is that why you're now her boss?" It was like the air shifted in the room. Every conversation stopped. My mother's hand froze halfway to the gravy boat. Megan's smirk vanished so fast I almost wished I had it on video. And me? I just took a sip of water and thought about how this moment, this perfectly timed, perfectly public revelation, was not an accident, not some fluke of workplace politics, but the end result of a year-long chain of events that started the day I overheard a phone call I was never meant to hear. You see, my sister has been the golden child for as long as I can remember, and I am not saying that out of jealousy. I am saying it because it is simply the truth that has shaped my entire family dynamic. Growing up, Megan was the one in the spotlight, the one the teachers called a natural leader, the one who got applause for things that, when I did them, barely got a nod. She was the homecoming queen, the captain of the debate team, the student body president, and if she missed a deadline or screwed something up, the narrative was always that she had been overextended because of her many responsibilities. I, on the other hand, was the dependable one, the one who stayed late to clean up, the one who quietly got the work done without needing a ribbon for it. It was almost comical how consistent it was. Megan was ambitious, I was reliable. Megan led, I helped. That was the story everyone in my family seemed perfectly content to keep telling themselves well into adulthood. When we both ended up in similar career fields, I thought at first it would finally be the great equalizer. After all, work is supposed to reward results, not family myths. I had been at my company for several years, steadily moving up, building a reputation for being someone you could trust to handle the hard stuff without drama. I never felt the need to broadcast every success, but people who mattered noticed. Then, about a year ago, I found out Megan had been hired into a different division of the same company. It was one of those coincidences that wasn't really a coincidence, since our mother had apparently put in a word with someone on the board, a connection I didn't even know she had. I found out about it after the fact, when Megan called to share the good news, in a tone that made it clear she assumed I would be impressed or maybe intimidated. From day one, Megan made no secret of the fact that she saw this as a stepping stone, not an entry point. She dropped hints in family group chats about exciting leadership opportunities, made comments about how quickly she expected to rise, and even told me over coffee that she was sure we would be working together soon, probably with me running point. She laughed when she said it, but it wasn't really a joke. The real turning point came one evening when I was still in the office late, finishing up a quarterly report, and I passed by one of the small conference rooms on the way to grab a coffee. Megan was inside with one of the senior VPs, a guy who usually dealt with upper-level strategy and rarely spoke directly to mid-level managers. They didn't see me, but I heard just enough to know that they were discussing a major opportunity that would involve a high-visibility project, one I had been quietly building the groundwork for over months. Megan's voice had that eager, performative confidence she uses in interviews, and the VP was nodding along as she said she was ready to take ownership and that it would be a perfect fit for her leadership style. I stood there in the hallway, holding my coffee cup, realizing that not only had she swooped into my professional territory without the slightest hesitation, but she was now positioning herself to take credit for work I had already laid the foundation for. And if I confronted her, she would act confused, maybe hurt, then tell everyone I was overreacting. I knew the playbook. I had seen it since we were kids. So instead of storming in or sending a panicked email to my boss, I walked back to my desk, opened my notebook, and started writing down everything I already knew about this project, every milestone we had hit, every obstacle we had overcome, every name of every person who had contributed to it. I wasn't just documenting the work, I was starting a record. That night, for the first time, I let myself think about what it would take to not only protect what I had built, but to make sure Megan could never again use me as a stepping stone. And as much as I wanted to believe I was just defending my own career, there was a deeper part of me, the part that had listened to a lifetime of subtle digs and smug smirks, that knew this could be bigger. This could be the moment the story changed. Of course, back then, I had no idea how far it would go or how perfectly it would all fall into place. I just knew that Megan had made her move, and now it was my turn to decide how I was going to respond. And if there's one thing my sister has never understood about me, it's that I don't move fast unless I'm sure of my footing, but when I do, I don't stop until I'm exactly where I plan to be. And that was the night I started planning for the moment that would one day leave my entire family staring at me in stunned silence, with Megan too shocked to speak. The night I decided that if she wanted to play the leadership game, I would make sure she finally understood what real leadership actually looked like. From the moment I overheard that conversation in the conference room, I knew confronting Megan head-on would be a waste of energy, because she thrived on drama. On spinning the narrative until she was the victim, and I was the jealous sister who couldn't celebrate her success. If I accused her of trying to take over my project, she would turn it into a family story about how I was too sensitive and afraid of competition, and that would be the only thing anyone remembered. So instead of playing into her strengths, I decided to lean into mine: patience, strategy, and an ability to see the long game when everyone else was busy chasing the quick win. I didn't tell a single soul what I had overheard, not even the few coworkers I trusted, because if Megan caught wind that I was aware of her plan, she would just change tactics, and I wanted her to think she was operating in complete secrecy. I started by making sure I had an airtight record of everything I had done on the project, from the original concept notes to the most recent performance metrics, not just for my own protection, but so I could back up my position without a hint of emotion if the time came. Every meeting I attended, every progress update I sent out, every small win that could be quantified, it all went into my files. I also became more intentional about where I placed my energy. I didn't just work hard, I made sure the right people saw me doing the work that mattered. It wasn't about showing off, it was about making sure the decision makers didn't have to guess who was actually holding things together. Megan, meanwhile, was already laying the groundwork for her big opportunity, which, as I found out through a little quiet digging, wasn't just a project handoff, but a 6-month leadership evaluation that the company used to decide promotions for senior roles. The process involved rotating through different high-stakes assignments, getting feedback from multiple departments, and presenting a final pitch to the executive team. Megan clearly thought she had it in the bag. After all, she had been personally encouraged to apply by a VP, and she was confident her networking skills would carry her through. The problem was, those skills only worked on people who didn't have to rely on her to actually deliver results. While she was busy organizing vision meetings and telling anyone who would listen about her leadership style, I was quietly shoring up alliances with people whose opinions actually carried weight in these evaluations. I never badmouthed her, because that would have made me look petty. Instead, I focused on delivering such clean, reliable results that any comparison between us would be obvious without me having to say a word. I asked thoughtful questions in cross-departmental meetings, made sure to follow up on requests faster than expected, and, most importantly, I offered solutions before problems escalated, which made me the person people came to when they needed something done right. Then, about 2 months into Megan's 6-month track, an opportunity landed in my lap that I could never have planned for but knew instantly I could use. Megan had been scheduled to lead a major client presentation, one that could make or break the quarter's numbers for her department, but a networking trip she had been bragging about for weeks overlapped with the date. Apparently, she had assumed someone else would cover for her while she was away, but when the scheduling conflict became clear, the VP she'd been cultivating suggested, almost offhandedly, that I step in, just to keep things on track. Megan called me that night, half pretending to be grateful, half sounding like she was making sure I understood this was a temporary favor. She even laughed and said, "Don't mess it up for me." I didn't just deliver the presentation. I spent the week before diving into every detail of the client's account, making sure I knew their priorities better than they did. I worked with our analysts to fine-tune the numbers, coordinated with marketing to align the messaging, and rehearsed the pitch until I could do it in my sleep. On the day, the client was so impressed that they asked me to be their direct point of contact moving forward, a request that went straight to the executive team and couldn't be quietly brushed aside. When Megan returned, she tried to act unfazed, congratulating me in front of a few colleagues while making a pointed joke about how even the backup player can have a good game. But I could see the irritation under the surface, because she knew she couldn't spin the situation, not when the client had explicitly requested me. Still, I said nothing, didn't gloat, didn't try to claim the spotlight, because the beauty of a long game is that you don't rush the reveal. From that moment on, I noticed a subtle shift. Megan started making quicker, more impulsive decisions, almost as if she was trying to prove she could move faster and think bigger than I could. She'd send out memos about new initiatives without checking if the data supported them, push through changes that caused unnecessary chaos, and generally create more noise than progress. I, on the other hand, kept doing exactly what I'd been doing, solving problems quietly, making sure the right people knew who had actually fixed them, and letting her choices dig a hole she didn't realize she was standing in. By the time we hit the halfway mark of her evaluation period, the contrast between us was starting to become obvious to the people who mattered. And when the next opportunity came along, the one that could flip the entire power dynamic between us, I was ready to step into it without hesitation, because I knew this wasn't just about proving myself anymore. This was about making sure Megan finally understood that leadership isn't something you declare in a meeting or slap on a resume. It's something you earn, and once you've earned it, no one can take it away from you. The thing about Megan is that she believes speed looks like power, so when she feels pressure, she only knows how to press harder on the gas, and once I understood that, my job became very simple. Because all I had to do was build a clean path for the work and leave just enough gaps in the noise for her to reveal herself. I did not sabotage anything, I did not lie, I did not whisper in dark corners. I just kept doing the real work in a way that was easy to verify, while she kept doing the performance in a way that was easy to question. And I let people draw their own conclusions without me having to say a word. It started small, with handoffs and status notes, because that is where sloppy leadership always shows first. When Megan asked for a summary of the client rollout plan, I sent her a precise outline with action items, owners, and dates, and I left out the speculative idea she had tossed around without data. Because I wanted to see if she would ask the right questions before she pitched it. She did not, and when she presented the plan to operations, she leaned on that idea as if it were approved and baked. And within a week, we were fielding confused emails from 3 teams who thought we were changing scope. I did not correct her in public. I followed up privately with a clear note that said, here is what is approved, here is what is proposed, here is what is still being considered, and I CC'd the people who actually had to do the work, with links to the decisions they had already signed off on, and I let the trail speak for itself. After that, Megan began pushing quick fixes that sounded decisive in a meeting, but fell apart when someone tried to run them, and instead of arguing, I adopted a rule for myself, which was to put every important decision through a simple filter that anyone could follow. What is the problem? What are the options? What is the risk? What is the cost? And who is accountable? I sent those one-page notes before every checkpoint, and I used calm language, and I attached the numbers, and I made sure the notes lived in the same shared folder where compliance pulled documentation, because I wanted the record to be public, boring, and undeniable. The next crack showed up in vendor management, where Megan had promised a faster turnaround by switching a deliverable to a firm she met at a conference. She was excited about them because they had a flashy deck and a founder who said all the right buzzwords, but the contract they sent over had a clause that would have locked us into auto-renewal at an ugly rate, and legal flagged it immediately. Megan brushed it off in a meeting and told them to push the paperwork through, which would have been a bad look for anyone, but in a leadership review it reads like you do not respect risk. I did not fight her in the room. I just sent legal a revised red line that aligned with our vendor policy and copied Megan on the email, so there was no confusion about who had saved the company money and who had tried to wave a problem away because it was inconvenient. Then came the forecasting mess, which was the first time I decided to be intentionally quiet in a way that forced a choice. Megan wanted to announce aggressive targets to the executive team to prove momentum, but the pipeline did not support her number. Still, she pushed for it in prep, smiling that confident smile and saying the team needed a stretch. I kept my face neutral and asked a single question, which was whether we wanted to anchor the room to a number we could defend on paper or a number that sounded good today and would need excuses later. She said results favored the bold. I said fine. Then I sent finance 2 models that showed the difference between her target and the defended target, with clear assumptions and a simple chart that made the risk obvious to anyone who glanced at it. I did not share those models with her before the meeting, and I did not have to, because when the CFO asked how we would bridge the gap between the stretch number and the pipeline, the slide I had built for the defended number appeared in the deck behind me, and the CFO turned to me, not to Megan, for the answer. I laid out the steps without drama, the CFO nodded, and the stretch number quietly died in that room without me having to kill it. From there, the feedback started to collect like dust on a shelf no one wanted to talk about. Quiet comments from engineering about unclear direction, polite notes from marketing about last-minute changes that cost time, a question from legal about why a sensitive approval had been rushed without the right sign-off. I never piled on, I never said, "See, this is what I meant." I just kept the work clean and the receipts cleaner, and when someone sent me a thank you for fixing fallout from one of her decisions, I replied with a simple "You're welcome" and copied the people whose opinions actually ended up in leadership files. I also started investing in people who had been ignored because they were not loud. There was a project manager named Aisha who knew the system better than anyone and had been treated like a traffic cop rather than a strategist. I gave her ownership of a cross-team plan and told everyone that if they had questions they should go to her first. And then I stood back and watched her run it like a pro. There was an analyst named Matteo who had built a small model that could save us hours every month. I put him in front of the executive team for 5 minutes. He nailed it, and after that, 2 directors asked if he could advise their teams. I was not building a fan club, I was building a record of how I led, and I wanted that record to be filled with other people's wins that had my fingerprints on the setup and none on the applause. Megan noticed the shift and tried to reassert control with a grand gesture. She scheduled an all-hands, announced a new initiative with a name that sounded important, and promised rapid gains by the end of the quarter. The problem was that the initiative overlapped with compliance requirements that were not optional, and when an audit request came in asking for proof of approvals, her project did not have the documentation. I could have let it burn, and a part of me wanted to, but this is where the revenge had to be smarter than the impulse, so I did something that looked like kindness and landed like a hammer. I sent the audit team a complete packet of approvals for the components that were already in flight. I bundled Megan's initiative into the existing framework so that it would be covered by the same controls. And I wrote a 1-paragraph note that said we have consolidated all related work under a single chain of accountability to ensure quality and speed. I put my name on the chain. The audit cleared, the executives thanked me, and Megan's big showpiece became part of my program with a single calm email. By the end of that week, my calendar pinged with a meeting I had not requested. Human Resources wanted to talk to me about a director opening that had just been authorized, a role that would formalize what I was already doing and, yes, put Megan directly under my line. I stared at the invite, let myself breathe, and clicked accept, and when I walked into that room 2 days later and saw who was sitting there, the VP who had promised Megan her big moment, the CFO who had asked me for the defensible number, and the head of HR with a neat stack of feedback forms, I knew the long game had finally arrived at the place I had been steering it toward since that night in the hallway, and I also knew that if I got this offer, Thanksgiving was going to be a very interesting day. When Human Resources walked me through the director role, I kept my tone even and my questions practical, because I knew the smartest thing I could do was make it look like the most natural next step in the world rather than a victory lap. So I asked about scope, about budget ownership, about whose feedback had informed the decision, and I did not ask a single thing about title glitter or perks, which mattered less to me than the simple fact that the reporting lines would be formal and that the Work I had carried on my back for months would finally have an official home with my name on the door. The interviews were almost anticlimactic, not because they were easy, but because every answer I gave was already sitting in their files in the form of clean deliverables and calm recoveries, which meant I did not need to sell a vision so much as describe what had already been done and how I planned to scale it without letting quality slide, and by the time I walked out of the final round I understood that the decision was already made, and all that was left was timing and optics. The offer arrived 2 days later in a short meeting where the VP, the CFO, and the head of human resources traded professional expressions that could pass for smiles, and I accepted with a single sentence about being grateful for the trust and focused on results, because I wanted them to remember later that I had not milked the moment, that I had made it about the work and not about my sister, even though we all knew very well what the new org chart would mean for both of us. The announcement email went out that afternoon, a simple company-wide note about my promotion that emphasized my track record during a difficult quarter and the way the programs under my leadership had stabilized delivery. And it included a short line about realigning teams for clarity, which was polite code for the part Megan cared about most, the line that would quietly place her under my management without saying her name. I did not tell Megan in advance, because there was nothing to discuss and no benefit in giving her time to spin a story, and I did not tell my parents either, because I did not feel like auditioning for approval I no longer needed. I let the email do the talking, and I took a long breath before I opened my calendar and started moving the work into the shape it should have had months ago. My first act was not revenge but structure, because I wanted the record to show that my leadership was defined by clarity, so I consolidated projects that were duplicative. I wrote down the 3 outcomes that mattered for the quarter in plain language. And I told everyone that decisions would be documented and that we would not waste energy on big promises when small consistent wins would build trust faster. Megan showed up in my office doorway that evening with a bright, brittle smile and a voice that hovered between cheerful and combative, and she said she wanted to align on the transition, by which she meant she wanted to know exactly how much room she had to keep doing whatever she wanted, and I invited her to sit, thanked her for the work she had already done, and handed her a 1-page plan that listed the deliverables in her area with dates, owners, and risks, and I said we would check in weekly and that I would handle executive communications so she could focus on execution where her strengths were most valuable. She stared at the page a fraction too long, then said something about how she was used to having more autonomy, which was her word for improvising, and I said autonomy is earned by hitting targets and leaving clean trails, which she did not like. But she could not argue with the logic without arguing with the job itself. In the days that followed, I did something that looked ordinary from the outside, but felt like an exhale I had been holding since we were teenagers. I promoted Aisha into a formal lead role with decision rights that matched the responsibility she had already been carrying, and I gave Mateo a mandate to standardize the forecasting model across teams so no one could play games with targets again. And I made sure those changes were sent through the same channels that used to be dominated by improvised announcements, and watching the team react with relief told me everything I needed to know about where loyalty had quietly been living this whole time. Megan tried to test the boundaries with a few side conversations and a couple of last-minute calendar invites that bypassed process, and I did not scold her or make a scene. I just declined the meetings with a note that said all decisions would live in the shared forum and all escalations would follow the posted path, and after the third decline she understood that the shortcuts were closed. If you are wondering whether I enjoyed it, the answer is complicated, because part of me wanted to savor the symmetry after years of being told to be the supportive one, but a bigger part of me was simply calm. Because the best revenge is not the heat of humiliation, it is the cool of control that cannot be clawed back, and every time I signed off on a plan that made sense or protected the team from a bad decision, I felt the click of something lining up that had been out of place for too long. I did give myself one private indulgence, though, and it was small enough to pass as professional kindness while landing exactly where I wanted it to land. I assigned Megan a project that looked shiny on the surface, but was fundamentally a discipline exercise. A cross-functional cleanup that required patient coordination, careful documentation, and zero shortcuts, and I told her that if she delivered it clean, it would be the best thing on her record, which was true, and also the only way to teach her what leadership looks like when the warm lights are off. Outside the office, the silence from my family surprised me less than it used to, because I realized they were most comfortable when Megan was the headline and I was the supporting text, and the new story did not fit their old script. So instead of calling me to say congratulations, they waited for a context that made it easier to talk about, which arrived right on schedule with the holiday invite that slid into my inbox like a dare. I almost declined, not out of fear but because I did not owe anyone a performance. Yet as I hovered over the response, I pictured Megan tossing out one of her little lines about leadership in a room where no one knew the truth. And I felt a steadiness settle in, the kind that comes from knowing you do not need to raise your voice because the facts will do the talking for you, and I clicked accept, and I told myself I would show up, be civil, answer honestly if asked, and let the chips fall. Exactly where they were already falling. On the morning of the dinner, I set my phone to do not disturb because I wanted my head clear, and as I drove over I rehearsed nothing, because the point was not to deliver a speech, but to let real life speak. And I walked in ready to be polite and quiet and done with proving anything to people who had never really been looking, and yet, as soon as Megan flashed that familiar smirk and made her comment about some people being born to lead, and Uncle Kevin turned and asked the question that cracked the room open, I felt the tiniest flicker of satisfaction that this moment, which looked spontaneous to everyone in that house, was the final step in a path I had drawn in pencil months earlier, and because restraint is a better teacher than gloating. I said nothing at first and let the silence breathe, which is where we will pick up, because what I chose to say next would decide whether this ended as a win or as a war. When Uncle Kevin asked that question that sliced through the chatter and landed right in the center of the table like a plate no one wanted to claim, I felt the whole room tilt toward me. And the old reflex that used to push me to smooth things over out of habit tugged at my throat for a second, but I let it pass, because the point of everything I had done this year was to stop protecting a story that never protected me, so I took my time. I set down my glass, met Megan's eyes without hostility, and said in a steady voice that did not invite argument that yes, I am her boss now, and then I added the line she had gifted me years ago and repeated again tonight, that some of us do have a natural talent for leadership. And it turns out that talent looks a lot like keeping promises, taking responsibility when things go sideways, and making sure the people doing the work are the ones who get the credit. There was no triumph in my tone, just plain truth, which landed harder than any speech. Because truth has a way of sounding like a verdict when the audience has been pretending not to hear it for too long. My mother blinked first and asked if this was temporary, as if the universe had misfiled something and clerical work could restore the correct order, and I said it is not temporary, it is the structure we needed at work and that structure is working. And I could feel my father scanning me for gloating and not finding it, which confused him more than if I had raised my voice. Megan tried to laugh in that bright way she does when she feels cornered, said something about how titles do not matter to people who know their worth, and I agreed with her, because in the end they do not, but accountability does. And that is why I had given her a project that would let her prove herself without shortcuts, and at that point, because I am done letting innuendo frame my life, I told the room exactly what that meant without a single extra flourish, that I had asked her to lead a cross-functional cleanup with tight documentation and zero wiggle room, that it was important and measurable and fair, and that she would either deliver it clean or she would not, and the outcome would be clear to everyone without me needing to interpret it. There was a long silence, the kind that used to make me fill it with comforts, but I let it stretch, and then Uncle Kevin, who apparently had learned a thing or two from his own career that he never bothered to share at holiday dinners, nodded and said that sounded like leadership to him, because leadership is not the person who loves the microphone, it is the person who keeps the lights on and the bills paid, and I almost laughed because it was the first time anyone in that house had defined leadership in a way that included me. Megan's boyfriend tried to save the moment by asking if our company encouraged sisters to compete, which was a clumsy question with a good instinct, and I said quietly that I had no interest in competing with Megan. that I had been competing only with the mess she left behind, and that now the mess was mine to prevent, which, if you have ever kept a team afloat while someone chased applause, you know is the most honest job description in the world. The revenge, if you want to call it that, happened in the way the room rearranged itself around reality, because that is how real power works when it is not trying to be loud, and once reality was acknowledged. I set the boundary I had promised myself I would set if the topic ever came up in a group, and I did it without heat, telling my parents that I was not going to revisit childhood debates about who was born to what. That we are grown and the evidence is public, that I wish Megan well in the work and I will support her when she does it well, and that outside the office I am done being measured against a version of me they invented to keep the peace. I said all of that in a voice I would use in any meeting with people I respect, which I do, even when they make it hard, because respect for myself now includes not performing the old role for their comfort. After dinner, Megan followed me into the hall with that tight smile she wears when she is trying to pull me back into the old pattern, and she asked if I had enjoyed the spectacle, and I told her nothing about tonight was a spectacle, that it was a correction, and that she had 2 clean roads in front of her that I had already put in writing as part of her development plan, which I had kept private until now because I am not interested in embarrassing her, and I laid them out with the same clarity I use with any employee who matters to the business, that she could deliver the cross-functional cleanup on time with full documentation and earn the autonomy she wanted. Or she could take the lateral transfer I had secured for her into a partner team where her networking would actually help and the risk would be lower, and I would back either choice and sign the strongest possible recommendation for the path she chose. But there would be no third road where she bypassed process because she felt destined. She stared at me, and for the first time in years I watched her listen instead of perform, and then she said something I did not expect, which was that she did not know which choice would make her look weaker. And I told her that the only weakness left here would be pretending a choice is a trap when it is a chance to stop running and build something solid. I did not wait for her answer, because answer or not, my work was already done, and I stepped outside with my coat over my arm and the quiet inside me that shows up when the last piece clicks into place. And as I reached my car, my phone buzzed with a calendar acceptance from a partner director whose name matters, confirming the hold I had placed weeks earlier for Megan's potential transfer, a small thing that looked like courtesy and felt like completion, because it meant the door I had promised her was real and ready, and whatever she decided would be her decision, not a story I had to carry. I sat there for a moment, letting the stillness settle, and I thought about how everyone at that table would tell a slightly different version of tonight, and that used to scare me, but it does not anymore. Because the one version that matters is the one that leaves the office each day as working software and clean audits and teams that do not dread meetings, and that version already has my name on it. If you are waiting for me to say I felt guilty, I did not, because I did not humiliate her, I did not leak anything, I did not play dirty, I just made the incentives honest and the consequences visible. And then I stopped apologizing for being the adult in the room, which turns out to be the kind of revenge that keeps paying dividends long after the thrill wears off. The next morning, I sent 2 emails, both short and professional, one to confirm Megan's project milestones with the shared folder link, and one to the team thanking Aisha and Mateo for the week's wins, and then I closed my laptop and made coffee. And I realized the loudest part of the checkmate was not Uncle Kevin's question or my answer, it was the absence of noise in my head where the old story used to live. I do not know which road Megan will take, and maybe that is the point, because the plan was never to decide for her, it was to remove the stage where she could make my work the backdrop for her performance, and now that the stage is gone, there is only the work and the record and the choice, and whichever way she turns, she will have to walk it on her own feet. And that is the win I wanted, not a confession or an apology or a scene, but a life that no longer bends around someone else's myth, which is not just a win, it is the final move.